Terrified Coyote pup stuck in a fence. Delivery driver noticed its eyes and froze on the spot. It was a Tuesday afternoon that felt exactly like every other Tuesday afternoon in the high desert, dry, relentless, and painted in monochromatic shades of beige and burnt sienna. Elias gripped the steering wheel of his delivery van, his knuckles white against the worn leather, navigating the washboard ruts of a gravel service road that didn't seem to appear on most standard maps. The air conditioning in the van had given up the ghost 3 miles back, leaving him with nothing but the hot, dusty wind blowing through the open window, carrying the scent of sagebrush and heated metal. His schedule was tight, as it always was. The algorithm that dictated his life allowed for precisely 3 minutes per drop-off, and he was already 7 minutes behind due to a flat tire earlier in the morning. The dust plume trailing behind his vehicle was the only sign of life in a landscape that seemed to have been holding its breath for centuries. He checked his mirrors, a habit born of years on the road, though out here there was rarely anyone to see. To his left, a barbed wire fence stretched endlessly toward the horizon, marking the boundary of a ranch so vast he hadn't seen a house or a barn in 20 minutes. The fence was old, the cedar posts bleached grey by the sun. The wire rusted to a deep orange that looked like dried blood against the pale grass. Elias shifted gears, the engine groaning in protest as he climbed a slight incline, his mind already drifting to the cold shower and the reheat dinner waiting for him at the end of this shift. He wasn't looking for anything out of the ordinary. In fact, his job depended on the ordinary, on the predictable rhythm of miles and packages. But the desert has a way of revealing things to those who are forced to look at it long enough. Just as he crested the hill, a flash of movement caught in his peripheral vision, a frantic, jerky motion that didn't fit the swaying rhythm of the wind-blown grass. It was low to the ground, tangled near the base of the fence line. Elias frowned, squinting against the glare of the sun. His first thought was that it was a plastic bag, or a piece of tumbleweed caught in the barbs, thrashing in the breeze. But as the van rolled closer, the shape solidified. It had weight. It had fur, and it was struggling with a desperation that sent a sudden, sharp jolt of adrenaline through Elias's tired system. He instinctively lifted his foot off the accelerator, the van slowing with a heavy crunch of gravel, dust billowing forward to engulf the hood. He shouldn't stop. The thought was automatic, drilled into him by efficiency meetings and performance reviews. Stopping meant explaining the delay. Stopping meant losing time he couldn't make up. But the creature on the side of the road gave another violent lurch, a spasm of pure panic, and Elias saw a small, dusty head snap up toward the sound of the approaching engine. It wasn't a dog. The ears were too large, the snout too narrow. It was a coyote, barely more than a pup, its body contorted in an unnatural angle as it fought against the unyielding grip of the wire. Elias slammed on the brakes, the van skidding slightly before coming to a halt in the middle of the empty road. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine and the frantic scrabbling sounds coming from the fence line. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe and stay with us. Elias sat there for a moment, his heart hammering a strange rhythm against his ribs. He was a city boy originally, transplanted to this rural route by necessity, not choice. His knowledge of wildlife was limited to what he saw on documentaries or as roadkill on the interstate. A coyote was a predator, a scavenger, something farmers shot on sight and city dwellers feared would snatch their small pets. But looking through the dusty windshield, he didn't see a predator. He saw a living thing in absolute distress. The pup was small, its fur matted with dirt and burrs, blending almost perfectly with the dry earth beneath it. It had clearly been there for a while. The ground around its hind legs was torn up, raw earth exposed where its paws had scrabbled uselessly for purchase. He unbuckled his seatbelt, the click sounding like a gunshot in the quiet cabin. Pushing the heavy door open, he stepped down onto the gravel, his boots crunching loudly. The heat hit him instantly, a physical weight pressing down on his shoulders. He took a slow breath, raising his hands slightly as if to show he was unarmed, though he knew the animal couldn't understand the gesture. "Hey there," he murmured, his voice rough from hours of silence. "Easy now." The sound of his voice caused the pup to freeze instantly. It stopped thrashing, its body going rigid, pressing itself flat against the hard ground in a futile attempt to disappear. This reaction broke Elias's heart more than the struggling had. It was the instinct of the hunted, to play dead, to hope the threat passes. Elias approached slowly, taking wide, deliberate steps. He kept his eyes on the animal, scanning the rest of its body to understand the predicament. The pup had tried to squeeze through a gap in the woven wire fence, likely chasing a rabbit or fleeing a larger predator. Its head and front shoulders had cleared the square opening, but its hips were too wide, or perhaps it had twisted in its panic. Now the rusted wire was dug deep into the soft fur of its midsection, pinching tight against the spine and hips. The more it had struggled, the more the wire had bitten into the skin, trapping it in a painful, terrifying vice. It was stuck halfway between freedom and the road, suspended in a cruel limbo. As Elias got within 10 feet, the pup's resolve to play dead shattered. It exploded into motion again, snapping its jaws at the air, letting out a high-pitched, gurgling yip that sounded like a cry for help and a warning all at once. Elias stopped dead in his tracks. He could see the white of its teeth, sharp as needles, and the frothy saliva gathering at the corners of its mouth. It was dehydrated, exhausted, and running entirely on fear. "I'm not gonna hurt you," Elias whispered, crouching down to make himself smaller, less imposing. The gravel dug into his knees through his uniform pants. "I'm just trying to see." That was when it happened. The pup, exhausted by its sudden burst of energy, slumped back against the wire, panting heavily. It turned its head and for the first time looked directly at Elias. The delivery driver felt the breath catch in his throat. The coyote's eyes were a striking, lucid amber, framed by dark lashes and the dusty mask of its face. They weren't the dead, shark-like eyes of a monster. They were wide, glassy, and filled with a profound, intelligent terror. In those irises, Elias saw a reflection of the vast, indifferent sky and his own silhouette crouching on the road. He saw the realization of death. The pup knew it was trapped. It knew it was vulnerable. And looking at Elias, it expected pain. Elias froze on the spot, mesmerized by the intensity of that gaze. It was a communication that transcended species. He felt a sudden, crushing wave of empathy that made his stomach turn. He remembered being a child, locked accidentally in a basement closet. The overwhelming darkness, the feeling that the walls were closing in, the certainty that he had been forgotten by the world. He saw that same specific paralyzing dread in the coyote's eyes. It wasn't just an animal. It was a consciousness experiencing the end of its world. The pup blinked, a slow, heavy motion, and let out a soft whine that was barely audible over the wind. It was a sound of surrender. "Okay," Elias said, his voice trembling slightly. "Okay, buddy, I see you." He stood up slowly, his knees popping. He looked up and down the fence line, scanning the horizon. Where was the pack? Where was the mother? Coyotes were social animals. A pup this size, maybe 4 or 5 months old, shouldn't be entirely alone. But the landscape was empty, just the heat haze and the distant circling silhouette of a hawk. If the mother was nearby, she was hiding well, likely watching this human approach her offspring with a mixture of fear and helplessness. Or maybe the pup was an orphan, a solitary wanderer who had made a fatal mistake. Elias took a step closer, and the pup flinched, but didn't fight. It was too tired. Its energy reserves were depleted. This was dangerous, Elias knew. A cornered, injured animal was unpredictable. Those teeth could tear through his hand in seconds. Rabies, infection, permanent nerve damage, all valid risks that his employee handbook would cite as reasons to get back in the van and call animal control. But animal control was 2 counties over. By the time they got out here, hours would have passed. The sun would be setting. The predators, the real ones, would come out. This pup wouldn't survive the night stuck in this fence. It would be a sitting duck for a mountain lion or a pack of feral dogs. He looked back at his van. The engine was idling, the hazard lights flashing silently against the bright daylight. He had a schedule. He had a quota. He had a life that required him to keep moving. But then he looked back at the amber eyes watching him with a terrified, pleading intensity. The pup shifted, and a fresh trickle of blood ran down its flank where the wire had sliced the skin. Elias felt a physical ache in his chest. He couldn't leave. He simply couldn't. The universe had placed him on this road at this exact minute for a reason. To drive away now would be to forfeit a piece of his own humanity. "I'm going to need gloves," Elias said aloud, talking to the coyote as if it were a customer. "And maybe a blanket. You're not going to make this easy, are you?" He backed away slowly toward the van, keeping his eyes on the pup. The animal watched him go, its ears twitching. It didn't struggle as he moved away, it just watched, waiting to see if this strange, two-legged giant was leaving it to die or coming back to finish the job. Elias reached the back of his van and threw open the rear doors. The heat inside was stifling, smelling of cardboard and packing tape. He rummaged through his emergency kit, a plastic bin he'd shoved under the passenger seat years ago and never used. He found a pair of thick leather work gloves, stiff from disuse, and a heavy wool blanket he used for winter breakdowns. It wasn't much. He didn't have wire cutters. He didn't have a tranquilizer. He just had his hands and a blanket. He grabbed a bottle of water from his cooler, the condensation cool against his palm. Walking back to the fence, he cracked the seal on the water bottle. The sound made the pup's ears perk up. It licked its dry chops instinctively. "Thirsty, huh?" Elias asked softly. "Yeah, I bet." He was close enough now to smell the animal, a mix of dust, wild musk, and the copper tang of blood. The pup was trembling violently, a continuous shudder that shook the wire fence. Elias stopped 3 feet away. He needed a plan. If he just grabbed the pup, it would bite him. If he tried to pull it backward, the barbs might tear the skin further. He had to push the wire apart, create space, and manipulate the animal's body back through the opening. All while the animal tried to defend itself from him. It seemed impossible. Elias looked into those amber eyes one more time. The fear was still there, but there was something else now. Confusion. The giant hadn't attacked yet. The giant had brought water. The pup let out a low, guttural growl, but it lacked conviction. It was a bluff. Elias knelt down in the dirt, ignoring the rocks digging into his shins. He pulled the leather gloves on, flexing his fingers to loosen the material. "Listen to me," he whispered, locking eyes with the trapped creature. "I'm going to hurt you to help you. I'm sorry, but I have to get you out." The wind picked up, whistling through the fence wires like a mournful song, setting the stage for a struggle that would require every ounce of patience Elias possessed. The wind howled across the open scrubland, a dry, mournful sound that seemed to carry the weight of the entire desert. Elias remained on his knees, the gravel biting into his skin through the fabric of his uniform, a sharp, grounding pain that kept him focused. The coyote pup watched him, its chest heaving in rapid, shallow breaths that rattled slightly in its throat. The initial burst of adrenaline that had fueled the animal's defensive snapping was fading, replaced by a lethargic heaviness. The amber eyes were still wide, fixed on Elias's face, but the lids were drooping. It was a dangerous sign. Shock was setting in. If the pup gave up now, if its heart slowed too much, no amount of untangling would save it. Elias moved with agonizing slowness, telegraphing every shift of his weight. He held the plastic water bottle in his left hand and the cap in his right. Carefully, he poured a small amount of clear liquid into the blue cap. The sound of the water splashing was tiny, insignificant against the vast silence of the plains, but to the pup, it was a thunderclap of sensory input. The animal's nose twitched, the black, leathery nostrils flared, pulling in the scent of moisture. In this arid landscape, water was the currency of life, more valuable than blood or bone. "Here," Elias whispered, extending his arm. He stopped 6 inches from the pup's snout. "It's just water, I promise." The pup flinched, pulling its head back as far as the wire would allow, a low growl rumbling in its throat. But the growl was weak, breaking into a whimper. Thirst, primal and overwhelming, was warring with instinct. Elias held his hand steady, though his deltoid muscle began to burn with the effort. He didn't look directly into the pup's eyes now. He looked at its paws, a submissive gesture in the language of canines. He waited. Seconds stretched into minutes. The heat radiating off the ground was intense, shimmering in waves that distorted the horizon. Finally, the pup's head moved forward. It was a jerky, hesitant motion. It sniffed the air, then the cap. Then a pink tongue darted out. One lap, then another. The hesitation vanished, replaced by desperate need. The pup drank the cap dry in seconds, its rough tongue scraping against the plastic. Elias poured another, and another. As the water hit the pup's system, a subtle change occurred. The glassy, distant look in its eyes sharpened slightly. The immediate fog of dehydration was lifting, if only by a fraction. "That's better, right?" Elias murmured. He felt a strange, tight knot in his chest loosen. It was the first bridge crossed. The animal had taken something from him, and hadn't been hurt. A contract had been signed in the dust. "I give, you receive, no one dies yet." Elias set the bottle down and picked up the wool blanket. This was the tricky part. He needed to cover the animal's head to keep it calm, and to protect his own hands from those needle-sharp teeth while he worked on the wire. He bunched the fabric in his hands, letting the pup smell it. It smelled of old oil and stale cabin air. Foreign, alien scents. The pup stiffened, the hackles along its spine rising in a ridge of bristly fur. I know, Elias soothed, his voice a steady drone. "It smells bad, but it's going to help." As he moved to drape the blanket, his mind drifted unbidden to the reason he was even out here on this God-forsaken road. He thought about the scanner in his van, the device that tracked his every movement, his speed, his idle time. He was 34 years old, and his life was dictated by an algorithm designed by people in a glass office 1,000 miles away. They didn't know about the heat. They didn't know about the washboard roads that rattled your teeth loose. They certainly didn't know about coyote pups stuck in fences. To the system, Elias was just a vector, a dot on a map moving from point A to point B. If he stopped moving, he became a problem, a red flag on a dashboard. He looked at the pup, trapped, held fast by a rusted line of steel it couldn't understand, let alone escape. The parallel hit him with the force of a physical blow. He felt trapped too. Trapped by debt, by the rent on his small apartment, by the endless cycle of work and sleep. Maybe that was why he had stopped, not just out of pity, but out of recognition. He knew what it felt like to struggle against something unyielding, to feel the wires digging in, holding you back while the world rushed past. "We're both stuck, aren't we?" he said, his voice cracking slightly. With a fluid motion, he tossed the blanket over the pup's head and front shoulders. The reaction was instantaneous. The pup exploded into a frenzy of thrashing, a muffled yelping rising from beneath the wool. Elias lunged forward, not to grab, but to press down gently, using his weight to pin the blanket to the ground on either side of the animal, creating a cocoon of darkness. Shh, easy. Stop moving, you're hurting yourself," Elias commanded, his voice firm now. The struggle lasted for 10 violent seconds, and then, abruptly, the pup went still. The darkness had done its job. Deprived of visual stimuli, the animal's panic short-circuited. It lay trembling beneath the heavy wool, waiting for the end. Elias kept his hands on the pup's shoulders through the blanket, feeling the rapid-fire beat of its heart. It was beating so fast it felt like a vibration rather than a rhythm. Thrum, 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 thrum. "Okay," Elias breathed, wiping sweat from his forehead with his shoulder. "Now let's see what we're dealing with." He moved to the rear of the animal, where the hips were wedged tight against the vertical stay of the fence and the horizontal barbed strands. Carefully, he peeled back the edge of the blanket to expose the injury site. He hissed through his teeth. It was worse than he had thought from the road. The pup had evidently tried to push through the square opening of the hog wire. It had made it halfway, but the hips were too wide. Instead of backing out, panic had driven it forward. The barbs on the lower wire had caught the loose skin of the flank, acting like fishhooks. Every time the pup had pulled forward, the barbs had dug deeper. But the real problem was the wire itself. It was under tension. The pup's struggle had twisted the vertical wire, creating a torsion spring effect that was clamping down on the animal's pelvis like a steel trap. The flesh around the wire was swollen, angry and red, weeping clear fluid and blood. The fur was matted into the wound. Elias reached out with his gloved hand and tested the tension of the wire. It was rigid, immovable. He tried to pull the vertical stay away from the pup's hip, gritting his teeth and putting his back into it. The wire groaned, a metallic screech, but it barely moved a millimeter. The pup whimpered under the blanket, a sound of pure misery. I'm sorry," Elias whispered, letting go. The wire snapped back into place, and the pup cried out again. Elias sat back on his heels, frustration bubbling up. He needed wire cutters. He needed a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters to snap this rusted iron and free the animal instantly. But he was a delivery driver, not a rancher. He had a box cutter in his pocket, useless against steel. He had a tire iron in the van, the tire iron. He scrambled up, dusting his knees off, and ran back to the van. He ignored the flashing hazard lights and the silent judgment of the GPS unit on the dashboard. He dug under the passenger seat, past the empty coffee cups and the crumpled manifests, until his fingers closed around the cold, L-shaped steel of the lug wrench. It wasn't a precision tool, but it was a lever, and right now, he needed leverage. He ran back to the fence. The pup was still under the blanket, motionless. For a second, Elias feared it had died of stress, his heart plummeting. But then he saw the blanket rise and fall with a ragged breath. Still alive, still fighting. Elias knelt down again, positioning himself behind the pup. He slid the flat, prying end of the tire iron between the vertical wire and the wooden fence post, trying to find a fulcrum. If he could bend the wire just an inch, it might be enough to slide the hips back through. "This is going to be loud," he warned the shrouded figure, "and it might shake the fence. Don't freak out on me." He gripped the tire iron with both hands and pulled. The metal groaned. The old cedar post creaked ominously. Elias strained, the veins in his neck standing out, sweat stinging his eyes. He wasn't a weak man. Lifting 50-pound boxes all day kept him fit. But this wire was high-tensile steel designed to keep 1,000-pound cattle in check. It fought him with the stubbornness of inanimate objects. Creak-ping! The tire iron slipped. Elias's hand slammed against the rusted wire. He yelled out, a sharp curse echoing across the desert, as a barb tore through the leather glove and scored a line of fire across his palm. He dropped the iron, clutching his hand to his chest. Blood welled up inside the glove, hot and sticky. "Damn it!" he hissed, rocking back and forth. Under the blanket, the pup shifted. It didn't thrash this time. Slowly, the small head poked out from under the wool, the amber eyes fixed on Elias again. The driver was hurt. The giant was bleeding. The scent of human blood mingled with the scent of coyote blood in the hot air. Elias took a deep breath, squeezing his injured hand to stem the flow. He looked at the pup. The animal wasn't growling. It was watching him with a new expression. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was confusion, bordering on curiosity. Why was this predator hurting itself? Why hadn't it attacked? Elias pulled the glove off, wincing. The cut was shallow but long, running across the meat of his thumb. He wiped it on his pants, leaving a dark smear on the beige fabric. He looked at the pup, and for a moment the rest of the world fell away. No van, no schedule, no debt. Just two injured creatures on the side of a forgotten road. "Okay," Elias said, his voice steady despite the pain. "That didn't work. Plan B." He didn't have a plan B yet, but looking at the pup, he saw something that steeled his resolve. The pup had stopped panting. It was watching him with an intensity that felt almost expectant. It was waiting for him to solve this. It had handed over agency. "You are the one with the thumbs," the eyes seemed to say. "You are the one who brought the water. Fix this." Elias reached out with his uninjured hand, bare now, the glove discarded, and slowly, tentatively, touched the top of the pup's head. The fur was coarse, coated in dust, but warm. The pup flinched, its eyes squeezing shut, expecting a blow. But Elias just let his hand rest there, feeling the skull beneath the skin, the life pulsing through the fragile frame. He scratched gently behind the ear, a universal gesture of peace. The pup let out a long, shuddering sigh. It leaned just a fraction of an inch into the touch. The bond snapped into place, invisible and unbreakable. Elias felt a surge of protectiveness so fierce it almost brought him to tears. He wasn't leaving. He would tear this fence down with his bare teeth if he had to. He looked at the wire again, his mind racing, looking for the weakness in the metal, the geometry of the trap. He wasn't just a delivery driver anymore. He was a guardian, and he was going to get this boy out. "I've got you," Elias whispered, the promise heavy in the air. "I'm not going anywhere." He picked up the tire iron again, ignoring the sting in his hand. He saw a different angle now, not the wire itself, but the clip holding the wire to the post. If he could twist that. He set to work, the sound of metal on metal ringing out like a bell, a summons to whatever forces watched over the lonely places of the world. The sun had shifted, casting long, distorted shadows across the gravel road. The heat was still oppressive, a physical weight that pressed the air from Elias's lungs, but the quality of the light had changed, turning the scrub brush into silhouettes of twisted gold. Elias was sweating profusely, his uniform shirt dark and clinging to his back, a stark contrast to the dry, dusty world around him. His hand throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache where the barb had sliced him, but the pain had become background noise, secondary to the task at hand. He was working on the fence clip, a thick piece of galvanized wire that bound the woven mesh to the cedar post. It was rusted solid, fused by years of exposure to rain and sun. Elias had wedged the flat end of the tire iron under the loop of the clip and was using the post as a fulcrum, applying steady, grinding pressure. The metal shrieked in protest, a sound that made the Coyote pup flinch under the blanket, its small body tensing with every scrape and groan of the steel. "Almost. Come on, you piece of junk," Elias grunted through gritted teeth. His muscles trembled with the effort. He needed the clip to snap or untwist, just enough to create slack in the main fence line. If he could get an inch of give, he could slide the pup's hips free. Suddenly, with a sharp crack that sounded like a pistol shot, the rusted clip gave way. It didn't untwist, it shattered, metal fatigue finally winning over structural integrity. The tension in the fence released violently. The woven wire sprang away from the post, vibrating with a low hum. Elias scrambled back, dropping the tire iron, his eyes instantly going to the pup. The sudden movement of the fence had terrified the animal. It thrashed wildly under the blanket, letting out a high-pitched yelp of pain as the movement jostled its trapped hips. Hey, it's okay, stop moving!" Elias shouted, lunging forward to place his hands on the blanket again, pinning the animal gently to the ground. "I know it hurt, I know, but look, it's loose. We've got slack." He waited for the pup to settle, his own breathing ragged. Under his hands, the trembling slowly subsided. He could feel the heat radiating from the small body, a feverish warmth that worried him. The stress was taking its toll. He needed to move fast. Cautiously, Elias peeled back the blanket again. The situation had changed. The fence was no longer pinned tight against the post, which meant the vertical tension was gone. Now, only the horizontal wires held the pup. But as Elias looked closer, his heart sank. The release of tension had revealed the true extent of the entrapment. The pup hadn't just been squeezed, it was snagged. One of the barbs on the lower wire had pierced the loose skin of the flank and hooked into the muscle. It was deeply embedded. If Elias tried to pull the pup backward now, he would tear the flesh open. The realization hit him with a wave of nausea. He couldn't just slide the animal out. He had to unhook it. And to do that, he had to manipulate the wire and the wound simultaneously. He looked at the pup's face. The amber eyes were open, watching him. The panic had receded into a dull, glazed look of endurance. The animal was fading. It had fought for hours before Elias arrived, and now, after the burst of adrenaline from the water and the struggle, it was crashing. "I can't just pull you out, buddy," Elias whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're hooked. I have to get the barb out first." He sat back on his heels, wiping his face with his uninjured hand. He needed a tool he didn't have. Pliers, wire cutters, something to cut the barb itself. He looked at the tire iron, useless for this delicate surgery. He looked at his box cutter. The blade was sharp, but short. He had to make a choice. He could try to cut the wire with the tire iron by bending it back and forth until it snapped, a process that would take time and shake the pup violently. Or he could try to manipulate the skin around the barb, essentially performing a minor surgical extraction in the dirt, with no anesthesia and dirty hands. He looked at the road, still empty. No cars, no help coming. He was it. "Okay," he said, a strange calm settling over him. "We're doing this the hard way." He reached for the water bottle again. He had about half left. He poured some over his hands, washing away the worst of the dust and his own blood. Then he poured a stream directly over the wound on the pup's flank. The animal hissed a sharp intake of breath and tried to bite the air, but the blanket restricted its movement. The water cleared away the dried blood and dirt, giving Elias a clear view of the barb. It was a nasty, rusted hook buried deep. "I'm going to hurt you," Elias said, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry, but I have to push it in to get it out. You understand? I have to unhook it." He didn't wait for an answer the coyote couldn't give. He moved his left hand to the pup's neck, gripping the scruff firmly through the blanket to hold the head down. With his right hand, his injured hand, he reached into the mess of fur and wire. He touched the metal. It was hot from the sun. He felt the skin around it, tight and swollen. He took a breath, held it, and pushed the wire forward, deeper into the wound, to disengage the barb from the muscle. The reaction was immediate and violent. The pup screamed, a sound that wasn't a bark or a howl, but a raw, primal shriek of agony. It bucked with incredible strength, nearly throwing Elias off. Elias gritted his teeth, leaning his full weight onto the animal's shoulders, pinning it down. I know, almost there," he yelled over the pup's cries. He twisted the wire. The barb snagged. He twisted again. He felt the metal slide against bone or cartilage, a sickening sensation that vibrated up his arm. Blood welled up fresh and bright red, slicking his fingers. He couldn't lose his grip. If he let go now, the barb would tear its way out, ripping the muscle to shreds. One more twist. He felt the point of the barb clear the flesh. "Now!" he shouted to himself. He pulled the wire back, guiding the hook out through the entry wound. It slid free with a wet, sucking sound. Elias didn't stop to celebrate. He immediately grabbed the pup's hips with both hands and pulled backward. The animal, sensing the release of pressure, scrambled with its front paws, digging into the dirt. "Push! Come on, push!" Elias urged. With one final coordinated effort, Elias pulling, the pup scrambling, the hips popped through the square opening of the fence. The pup tumbled backward onto the gravel road, rolling over twice before coming to a stop. Free. Elias fell back onto his butt, gasping for air, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He stared at the pup. The coyote lay on its side in the dirt, panting heavily. It didn't run. It didn't try to escape. It just lay there, its chest heaving, blood matting its flank. Elias watched, terrified that he had killed it in the process of saving it. Had the shock been too much? Had he severed an artery? "Hey," he whispered. "Hey, you okay?" For a long moment, there was no movement. Then slowly, the pup lifted its head. It looked at its flank, sniffing the wound, then turned its gaze to Elias. The look was different now. The terror was gone. In its place was a profound, exhausted bewilderment. The giant had hurt it. The giant had held it down. But the giant had also set it free. The wire was gone. The trap was broken. Elias reached for the water bottle again. It was empty. He cursed softly. He needed to clean that wound properly. He needed to get the pup to a vet or a rehab center. He couldn't just leave it here, injured and weak. It wouldn't last a day. He stood up, his legs wobbly. "I'm going to get more water," he said, backing toward the van. "Don't go anywhere." As he turned to the van, a movement on the horizon caught his eye. He froze. At the top of the ridge, about 200 yards away, a silhouette stood against the sun. It was a coyote, a full-grown adult. Its coat was a mix of grey and rust blending with the sagebrush. It was watching them. Elias's heart hammered. The mother, the pack. The adult coyote threw its head back and let out a series of yips and howls, a complex, eerie song that echoed across the valley. It was a call, a summons. On the ground, the pup's ears swiveled forward. It let out a weak, answering whine. It tried to stand, its back legs trembling, but collapsed back into the dust. It was too weak to walk. Elias looked from the pup to the mother on the ridge. He was in the middle of something ancient and wild. The mother wouldn't come closer while he was there. She was too smart, too wary of man, but she wouldn't leave her pup either. It was a standoff, and the pup couldn't move. Elias realized with a sinking feeling that saving the animal from the fence was only the first half of the battle. If he left now, the mother might come down, but could she help the pup walk? Could she defend it if it couldn't run, or would she eventually have to abandon it to the elements? He looked at his watch. He was now 45 minutes behind schedule. His dispatcher had probably already flagged him. He could lose his job for this. He could lose the route. He looked at the pup, struggling to rise again, its eyes fixed on the figure on the ridge. It wanted to go to her. It wanted its mother. Elias made a decision. He walked to the back of the van and grabbed a cardboard box, an empty one from a previous delivery. He flattened the bottom and grabbed the blanket. "I'm not leaving you here to die in the dirt," he muttered. "Not after all that." He walked back to the pup. The adult coyote on the ridge barked, a sharp warning sound. Elias ignored it. He knelt down beside the pup. "I'm going to lift you up," he said softly. "It's going to hurt, but I'm taking you to her, or I'm taking you with me. We'll see what she says." He slid his arms under the pup, one under the chest, one under the injured hips. The pup growled, snapping at his face. But Elias turned his head away, taking the nip on his shoulder. He lifted. The animal was surprisingly light, barely 20 pounds of bone and fur. He stood up, holding the wild creature in his arms like a child. The pup went rigid, its eyes wide, staring at the ground receding beneath it. Elias turned and began to walk, not toward the van, but off the road, toward the ridge, toward the mother. He was walking into the desert carrying a wounded predator, leaving his vehicle and his livelihood behind on the gravel road. It was insane. It was reckless. But as he walked, he felt a strange sense of peace. He was doing the only thing that made sense. The mother coyote watched him come. She didn't run. She stood her ground, her yellow eyes locked on the man carrying her young. The walk to the ridge was harder than Elias expected. The ground, which looked flat from the road, was actually a treacherous landscape of hidden burrows, loose shale, and clumps of prickly pear cactus that grabbed at his boots. The heat was a physical adversary, pushing against his chest, drying the sweat on his skin instantly. In his arms, the Coyote pup was a dead weight of tension and heat. It had stopped struggling, perhaps sensing that fighting was futile, or perhaps simply overwhelmed by the surreal nature of being carried by a human. Elias kept his eyes on the ridge. The adult Coyote, the mother he assumed, hadn't moved. She stood like a statue carved from the desert rock, her silhouette sharp against the blinding blue sky. She was large for a coyote, her coat thick and healthy, a testament to her survival skills in this unforgiving land. Her ears were pricked forward, tracking every crunch of Elias's boots, every heavy breath he took. She wasn't growling, wasn't pacing. She was waiting. It was a display of discipline that unnerved him. "I'm bringing him," Elias called out, his voice sounding thin and foolish in the vast space. "I'm just bringing him to you." He felt ridiculous talking to a wild animal, but the silence was too heavy to bear. He needed to fill it, to signal his intent. He wasn't a hunter. He wasn't a threat. He was a delivery service, making the strangest drop-off of his career. As he closed the distance to about 50 yards, the mother finally moved. She lowered her head, her hackles rising slightly, and let out a low, rumbling growl that vibrated in Elias's chest. It was a clear line in the sand. This far, and no farther. Elias stopped. He was breathing hard, his arms aching from the strain of holding the pup. The wound on the pup's flank was bleeding sluggishly, staining Elias's uniform shirt. He looked down at the small creature. The pup was looking at the mother, its ears flattened, letting out a soft, high-pitched whine. It was the sound of a child reaching for a parent. "Okay," Elias panted. "Okay, this is close enough." He slowly knelt down in the sagebrush, mindful of the cactus. He lowered the pup to the ground, setting it down gently on a patch of relatively soft sand. The pup didn't immediately bolt. It lay there for a second, gathering its strength, then clumsily scrambled to its feet. It swayed, favoring the injured leg, holding it high off the ground. Elias backed away slowly, his hands raised. "Go on," he whispered. "Go to Mama." The pup took a few hopping steps, then collapsed. It was too weak. The blood loss, the dehydration, the shock. It was too much. It let out a sharp cry of frustration and pain, looking back at Elias and then up at the mother. The mother coyote took a step forward, then another. She was wary, her eyes darting between the pup and Elias. She knew the man was too close, but the distress of her offspring was overriding her instinct for self-preservation. Elias realized he was the problem. He was the barrier. He needed to leave. He needed to disappear. "I'm going," he said, backing up faster now. "I'm leaving." He turned and began to walk back down the slope, forcing himself not to run, not to trigger a chase instinct. He walked 10 yards, 20, 50. When he reached the bottom of the wash, he turned back. The mother was at the pup's side. She was licking the wound on its flank, her tongue working with frantic, tender efficiency. She nudged the pup with her nose, urging it to stand. The pup whined, leaning against her leg. It was a scene of intimate, primal affection that made Elias's throat tight. But then reality crashed back in. The pup stood up, took 3 steps, and fell again. The mother nudged it harder, barking a sharp command. The pup tried, scrabbling in the dirt, but its back leg gave way. It couldn't walk, not the miles it would likely take to get to a den or water. Elias stood there, watching the tragedy unfold. The mother paced around the fallen pup, looking at the horizon, then at Elias. She was calculating. She couldn't carry him. She couldn't defend him here in the open. If he couldn't move, he was dead. It was the brutal math of the wild. Elias felt a cold pit in his stomach. He had freed the pup from the fence, but he hadn't saved it. He had just moved the death scene from the roadside to the hillside. He looked back at his van, a white speck in the distance. He looked at the coyotes. He had a choice. He could get in his van, drive away, and tell himself he did his best. That nature was cruel, and it wasn't his place to interfere further. That was the sensible choice, the rational choice. Or he could finish the job. Elias cursed, a long creative string of profanity that startled a lizard on a nearby rock. He turned around and started walking back up the hill. The mother coyote saw him coming and stiffened. She stood over the pup, baring her teeth. This time her growl was a roar. She wasn't going to let him close again. She had reclaimed her pup, and she would fight for it. Elias stopped at 50 yards again. He sat down on a rock. He took off his cap and wiped his brow. He wasn't going to fight a mother coyote. That was suicide. But he wasn't leaving either. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. No signal. Of course. He was in the dead zone. He looked at the mother. "I can't help him if you don't let me," he said, his voice conversational. "He needs a doctor. He needs stitches. You can't give him stitches." The coyote stared at him. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't leaving. He was waiting. Elias sat there for 10 minutes, then 20. The sun began to dip lower, the shadows stretching out like fingers. The pup lay still, its breathing shallow. The mother paced, agitated, torn between the threat of the man and the needs of the pup. Then Elias had an idea. It was stupid. It was dangerous. But it was all he had. He stood up and took off his uniform shirt. He was wearing a white undershirt beneath it. He laid the uniform shirt on the ground. Then he took the water bottle, the empty one, and set it on the shirt. He backed away. "I'm going to get water," he pantomimed, pointing to the van. "Water." He turned and walked all the way back to the van. He grabbed a gallon jug of water from his emergency supplies, the one he kept for the radiator. He also grabbed a package from the back, a box of beef jerky he had bought for his own lunches for the week. He walked back up the hill. The mother was still there. She watched him approach. He stopped at the shirt. He poured water into the empty bottle's cut-off bottom. He quickly sliced it with his box cutter to make a bowl. He opened the beef jerky and scattered a few pieces on the shirt. Then he backed away, far away, 100 yards. He sat down and waited. The scent of the beef jerky drifted on the wind. The mother's nose twitched. She was hungry. Nursing mothers were always hungry. She looked at the food. She looked at Elias. She looked at the pup. She moved toward the shirt. Cautiously, belly low to the ground, she snatched a piece of jerky and bolted back to the pup. She ate it in one gulp. She waited. Nothing happened. The man didn't move. She went back. She drank from the water bowl. She took another piece of jerky. Elias watched, his heart pounding. He was building trust, inch by inch, calorie by calorie. But trust wouldn't heal the leg. He needed to get the pup in the van. He stood up slowly. The mother froze. "I'm taking him," Elias said loudly. "I'm taking him to a vet. I'll bring him back, I swear." He walked toward them, not aggressively, but with purpose. He didn't stop this time. The mother growled. She snapped her jaws. She feinted a charge. Elias kept walking. He made himself tall. He didn't look her in the eye. He looked at the pup. "I'm sorry, Mama," he said, "but he's dying." When he was 10 feet away, the mother lunged. She came within inches of his leg, her teeth snapping on empty air. It was a bluff charge, a final warning. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't stop. He stepped past her, placing his body between her and the pup. He knelt down, exposing his back to the angry predator. It was the most terrifying moment of his life. She could hamstring him in a second. She could tear his throat out. But she didn't. She stood there, 5 feet away, panting, watching. She sensed something. Maybe it was the smell of the water he had poured on the pup earlier. Maybe it was the lack of fear scent. Elias was beyond fear now. He was in a state of hyper-focused determination. Or maybe, just maybe, she knew. Elias scooped up the pup. The animal was limp, barely conscious. "I've got you," he whispered. He stood up and turned to face the mother. He held the pup out slightly, showing her. "I'll bring him back," he said again. He turned and walked down the hill. He didn't look back. He felt her eyes on his spine, burning like lasers. He expected the attack with every step, but it never came. He reached the van. He opened the passenger door and placed the pup on the floorboard, on top of the wool blanket. He climbed into the driver's seat. His hands were shaking so bad he could barely put the key in the ignition. He started the engine. He looked out the window. The mother coyote was standing on the road, right where he had parked. She was watching the van. Elias put the van in gear. He drove slowly, careful not to jostle the passenger. As he pulled away, he looked in the rearview mirror. The mother coyote started to run. She was following the van. She ran alongside the road, leaping over sagebrush, keeping pace with the vehicle. "You're not giving up, are you?" Elias said, a lump in his throat. He drove for a mile, 2 miles. The coyote kept coming. She was tireless, a ghost in the dust, but she couldn't keep up forever. The van picked up speed as the road smoothed out. The figure in the mirror grew smaller, smaller, until she was just a dot, then nothing. Elias was alone with the dying pup. He hit the pavement of the county road and floored it. He had a schedule to keep, but the schedule had changed. The destination was no longer a drop-off point. It was the nearest vet clinic, 40 miles away. And he had about 30 minutes before the pup bled out. The van rattled as Elias pushed it to 70 miles per hour, the engine whining in protest against the heat and the speed. The air coming through the open windows was a blast furnace, drying the sweat on his face into a salty crust. On the floorboard, the coyote pup was motionless, a bundle of dusty fur and shallow breaths. Elias kept glancing down, his heart skipping a beat every time the rise and fall of the small ribcage seemed to falter. "Hang in there," he muttered, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles ached. "Don't you quit on me now. We didn't go through all that for you to quit." He reached for his phone again. 1 bar of signal, just enough. He fumbled with the screen, his thumb slipping on the glass, and dialed the number for the emergency vet clinic in the next town over. A place he knew only because he delivered their medical supplies every Thursday. "High Desert Veterinary. This is Sarah," a voice chirped, sounding impossibly calm against the backdrop of Elias's panic. "Sarah, it's Elias, the delivery guy. Listen, I'm coming in hot. I've got an emergency." "Elias, are you okay? Did you have an accident?" "Not me. I have a dog, hit by a fence. I mean, stuck in a fence. Deep laceration, possible internal injuries, severe dehydration. He's fading fast. I'm 20 minutes out." There was a pause. "A dog? Is it your dog?" "Does it matter?" Elias snapped, then immediately softened his tone. "Look, just tell Dr. Evans I'm coming. Please, get the fluids ready. He's lost a lot of blood." Okay. Bring him to the back entrance." "We'll be ready." Elias threw the phone onto the dashboard and focused on the road. The asphalt shimmered in the heat, creating mirages of water that vanished as he approached. He drove with a reckless precision, cutting corners, ignoring speed limit signs. He was a man possessed. The image of the mother coyote running behind the van was burned into his retina, a silent promise he had to keep. The pup let out a soft, gurgling sound. Elias looked down. A fresh trickle of blood was pooling on the rubber mat. The vibration of the van was reopening the wound. "Damn it!" Elias hissed. He reached down with his right hand, blindly feeling for the pup. He found the head and stroked it gently. "Stay with me. Stay with me." The miles blurred. The landscape shifted from open scrub to scattered ranch houses, then to the outskirts of the small town. Elias blew through a stop sign, earning a honk from a pickup truck. But he didn't care. He swung the van into the parking lot of the clinic, tires screeching, and backed up to the loading dock. He was out of the door before the engine died. He ran to the passenger side, scooped up the pup in the blanket, and sprinted for the back door. It flew open before he reached it. Dr. Evans, a stern woman in her 50s with graying hair and sharp eyes, stood there with a gurney. "Put him down," she commanded. Elias laid the bundle on the metal table. Dr. Evans pulled back the blanket. She paused for a fraction of a second. "Elias," she said, her voice low, "this isn't a dog. He's a patient," Elias said, his chest heaving. "Please." Dr. Evans looked at Elias, at his torn uniform, his bloodied hand, the desperation in his eyes. Then she looked at the pup. She saw the wire cuts, the dehydration, the life fading from the amber eyes. "Get him into Trauma 1, she barked at the tech behind her. "I need an IV line, Stat. Start fluids. Lactated ringers. Get the crash cart." They wheeled the gurney away, a flurry of activity disappearing behind swinging double doors. Elias stood alone on the loading dock, the adrenaline suddenly draining out of him, leaving him hollow and shaking. He looked down at his hands. They were covered in blood, his own and the Coyote's. Sarah, the receptionist, came out with a wet towel. "Elias, you're bleeding." "I'm fine," he mumbled, taking the towel. He wiped his hands, the cool water stinging his cut. "Is he going to make it?" "Doctor, Evans is the best," Sarah said gently. "Come inside. You need to sit down." Elias sat in the waiting room for 3 hours. The clock on the wall ticked with agonizing slowness. Other people came and went. A woman with a cat in a carrier, a rancher with a limping border collie. They looked at Elias with curiosity and suspicion. A delivery driver, covered in dirt and blood, sitting with his head in his hands, staring at the floor. He thought about his route. He was now 4 hours behind. His boss had left 3 voicemails. He hadn't listened to them. He knew he was fired. He didn't care. All that mattered was the creature in the other room. Finally, the double doors opened. Dr. Evans walked out, pulling off a surgical mask. She looked tired. She walked straight to Elias. He stood up, his legs stiff. "Well, he's alive," she said. Elias let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding since the fence line. "Oh, thank God." "It was touch and go, Doctor." Evans continued, her face serious. "The wire missed the femoral artery by a millimeter. We stitched the muscle, cleaned the wound, and pumped him full of fluids and antibiotics. He's stable, but weak, very weak." She crossed her arms. "Now, Elias, we need to talk. That is a wild animal. I am legally required to report this to Fish and Game. They don't usually rehab coyotes. They euthanize them." Elias felt the blood drain from his face. "What? No, you can't. I saved him." "I know you did. And I treated him because I took an oath to relieve suffering. But the law is the law. If I call them, they will come and take him." Elias stepped closer, his voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "Don't call them." Dr. Evans raised an eyebrow. "Elias, please, just give him a few days. Let him heal. Then I'll take him back. I know where his mother is. She's waiting for him. I saw her. She followed the van." Dr. Evans stared at him. She saw the intensity in his eyes, the absolute conviction. She looked at his bandaged hand. She sighed, rubbing her temples. "I have a stray dog in Kennel 4, she said slowly, emphasizing the words. "A mixed breed, very aggressive, needs isolation, no visitors. If he happens to recover in 3 days, and if someone happens to come pick him up and take him away before I get around to filing the paperwork, well, I can't be everywhere at once." Elias could have kissed her. "Thank you. Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," she warned. "He's wild. He's going to be terrified when he wakes up. And you need to go get that hand looked at. You need a tetanus shot now." Elias nodded. "I will. Can I see him?" "Just for a second?" Dr. Evans hesitated, then nodded. Quietly, she led him back through the sterile hallway to a quiet room in the back. Inside a large metal crate, the pup was lying on a soft towel. An IV line ran into his front leg. He was asleep, his breathing deep and rhythmic. He looked small and vulnerable, stripped of his wild context. Elias knelt by the cage. "I told you I'd get you help," he whispered. "Rest up. We've got a date with your mum in 3 days." He left the clinic and walked back to his van. It was evening now. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant hues of purple and orange. He sat in the driver's seat and finally listened to his voicemails. "Elias, where are you? You're off route. Elias, this is a formal warning. "Elias, don't bother coming in tomorrow. We're sending a recovery team for the van." He put the phone down. He was unemployed. He had a rent payment due in a week. He had a cut hand and a ruined uniform. He looked at the sunset and smiled. A real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. He felt lighter than he had in years. He had lost his job, but he had found something else. He had found his humanity again. He started the van. He had to go home, clean up, and figure out how to pay for the vet bill. But first he drove to the nearest burger joint. He ordered 2 double cheeseburgers. He ate one. He saved the other one in the wrapper. For the mother, he thought, when I go back. The next 3 days were a blur of anxiety and anticipation. Elias sold his gaming console and his guitar to pay the vet bill. He ignored the calls from the delivery company. He spent his time mapping out the location where he had left the mother, studying satellite images, trying to pinpoint the exact ridge. On the 3rd morning, he arrived at the clinic before it opened. Dr. Evans was waiting. "He's ready," she said. "He's been tearing up the bedding. He wants out." They sedated the pup lightly for the transport, just enough to keep him calm. Elias carried him to his own car this time, a beat-up sedan that smelled of old fast food. He placed the pup in a large dog crate in the back seat. "Good luck, Elias," Dr. Evans said, handing him a bag of antibiotics. "Slip these into some meat if you can. If not, well, nature has its own ways." "Thanks, Doc, for everything." Elias drove out of town, back onto the gravel roads, back into the heat and the dust. The drive took an hour. He found the spot. The tire tracks from his van were still visible in the dirt. He parked the car and killed the engine. The silence of the desert rushed back in, heavy and familiar. He got out and opened the back door. The pup was awake, groggy but alert. He smelled the air, the sage, the dust, the home scent. He whined, scratching at the crate door. Elias opened the crate. "Okay, buddy, end of the line." He reached in and lifted the pup out. The animal didn't bite. He didn't struggle. He knew. Elias carried him up the ridge to the exact spot where he had left the mother 3 days ago. He set the pup down. The bandage on the flank was clean and white against the dusty fur. The pup stood, testing the leg. It held. He took a few steps, then looked back at Elias. Elias sat down on a rock. "Call her," he whispered. The pup threw his head back and let out a yip, a sharp, clear sound that cut through the wind. They waited. 1 minute, 2. Then, from the shadow of a ravine a quarter-mile away, a shape emerged. Then another, and another. 3 coyotes. The mother was in the lead. She stopped, sniffing the air. She smelled the medicine, the human, but she also smelled her pup. She broke into a run. The pup ran to meet her. It was a clumsy, limping run, but it was full of joy. They met in the middle of the sagebrush flat. The mother knocked the pup over, licking his face, his flank, his ears. The other 2 pack members, siblings maybe or aunts, circled them, yipping and jumping. Elias watched from the ridge, tears streaming down his face. He was invisible to them now. He was just part of the landscape. The reunion lasted for 5 minutes. Then the mother turned and looked up the hill. She looked right at Elias. She held his gaze for a long, silent moment. There was no aggression in her posture, no fear, just an acknowledgement. "I see you. I remember." She turned back to her pack. She barked once, and they began to move, trotting away into the vast, open desert, disappearing into the heat haze. Elias sat there until they were gone. Until the desert was empty again. He stood up, dusted off his pants, and walked back to his car. He had no job. He had no money. But as he drove back toward the city, he knew he would be okay. He had looked into the eyes of the wild and been recognized, and that was worth more than any paycheck. The silence of the apartment was different from the silence of the desert. It was stagnant, heavy with the hum of the refrigerator and the distant muffled sounds of city traffic. Elias sat on his worn-out sofa, staring at the blank screen of his TV. It had been 2 days since he released the pup. 2 days of applying for jobs, dodging calls from debt collectors, and eating ramen noodles. His hand was healing well, the cut knitting together into a jagged red line that would likely scar, a permanent souvenir of the day his life derailed. He traced the line with his thumb, feeling the raised skin. He didn't regret it, not for a second. But the reality of his situation was closing in. The rent was due in 4 days. His bank account was in the double digits. He needed a job, any job. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. He ignored it, assuming it was another automated collection call. But it buzzed again and again. He picked it up. It was a number he didn't recognize. Local area code. "Hello? Is this Elias?" A woman's voice. Familiar. "Yeah, this is him. This is Sarah from High Desert Veterinary. Dr. Evans wanted me to call you." Elias sat up straighter. "Is everything okay? Did I forget to sign something?" "No, nothing like that. Actually, Dr. Evans was wondering if you could come in today. She wants to talk to you." "Talk to me? About what?" "She didn't say, just asked if you could stop by around noon." Elias checked the time. It was 11:15. Sure, I can be there." He hung up, confused. Had they found out about the release? Was he in trouble? Had Fish and Game come sniffing around? Anxiety tightened his chest. He grabbed his keys and headed out. When he arrived at the clinic, the waiting room was full. Sarah waved at him from behind the desk and pointed to the back. "Go on, back to her office. She's expecting you." Elias walked down the hallway, the smell of antiseptic and wet dog triggering a vivid memory of the last few days. He knocked on the office door. "Come in." Dr. Evans was sitting at her desk, surrounded by stacks of paperwork. She looked up and took off her glasses. "Elias, thanks for coming." "Is everything all right, Doc?" Elias asked, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "Sit down." She gestured to the chair opposite her. "Everything is fine. Better than fine, actually." She shuffled some papers. "I made a few calls after you left the other day. I have a friend over at the Raptor Rehabilitation Center in the canyon, and another contact who runs a sanctuary for retired working dogs." Elias frowned. "Okay? They're always looking for people," she said, looking him in the eye. "People who have, let's call it, instinct. People who don't freeze when an animal is hurt. People who are willing to drive 40 miles with a bleeding coyote in their passenger seat." Elias blinked. I don't have any training. I'm just a delivery driver." "You were a delivery driver," she corrected. "I heard you lost your job." Elias looked down at his hands. "Yeah, word travels fast." "Small town," she shrugged. "Listen, Elias. You have something you can't teach in vet school. You have empathy that overrides fear, and you have the grit to act on it. That's rare." She slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was a job description: Field Rescue Technician, Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. "It doesn't pay a fortune," she said, "but it's better than minimum wage, and it comes with training. They need someone to handle the difficult recoveries, the ones in the bad terrain, the ones that require patience." Elias picked up the paper. His hands were shaking slightly. He read the words, but they blurred together. Rescue, transport, rehabilitation. "I told them about you," Dr. Evans continued. "I told them about the fence, about the mother. They want to meet you. Today." Elias looked up at her. "You did that for me? You saved a life that no one else would have bothered with," she said simply. "That deserves a second chance. For both of you." Elias felt a lump in his throat. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," she smiled, "and then get out of my office. I have a waiting room full of neurotic poodles." Elias drove to the interview in a daze. The rehabilitation center was located in the foothills, a sprawling compound of aviaries and enclosures tucked into the canyon walls. The air smelled of pine and sage. The interview was short. The director, a weathered man named Tom, asked him one question. "Why did you go back up the hill?" Elias thought about it. "Because she was waiting," he said, "and because he was hers." Tom nodded. "You're hired. Can you start tomorrow?" Elias started the next day. The work was hard. It was dirty. He spent his days hiking into ravines to retrieve injured hawks, climbing trees to rescue stranded raccoons, and driving the center's truck, a beat-up Fork 4 that had working air conditioning, across the county. He learned how to handle talons and teeth. He learned how to bandage a wing and how to tube feed a fawn. He learned the names of the plants and the patterns of the weather. He was good at it. He was calm. Animals responded to him. They seemed to sense the quiet stillness in him, the lack of predation. 6 months passed. The seasons changed. The scorching heat of summer gave way to the crisp gold of autumn, and then the biting cold of winter. Elias moved out of his apartment and into a small cabin on the center's property. He was happy, truly, deeply happy. One afternoon in late winter, Elias was driving back from a release, a golden eagle that had recovered from lead poisoning. He was on the same gravel road where he had found the pup. He hadn't been back this way in months. He slowed down as he approached the fence line. The wire had been repaired, a shiny new section of mesh replacing the rusted trap he had broken. He smiled at the memory. He pulled the truck over and turned off the engine. The desert was silent, covered in a light dusting of snow that sparkled in the low sun. He got out and walked to the fence. He stood there, leaning against the post, breathing in the cold air. "Hey," he said to the empty landscape, "hope you're doing okay out there." He didn't expect an answer, but as he turned to leave, he saw tracks in the snow, fresh tracks, coyote tracks. They ran along the fence line, then veered off toward the ridge. There were 3 sets, 2 large, 1 slightly smaller, but growing fast. Elias followed them with his eyes. They led up to the crest of the hill, to the exact spot where the mother had waited, and there, sitting in the snow, watching him, was a coyote. It was the pup. He was almost fully grown now, his winter coat thick and silver-tipped. The scar on his flank was hidden by fur, but Elias knew it was there. The coyote sat tall, his ears pricked. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't running. He was just watching. Elias raised his hand in a wave. "Look at you," he whispered. "You made it." The coyote dipped his head, a subtle acknowledging nod. Then he turned and trotted away, disappearing over the ridge to join his pack. Elias stood there for a long time, watching the empty ridge. The wind blew, cold and clean. He walked back to his truck. He had work to do. There was a report of a bobcat caught in a drainpipe 10 miles east. Another life to save, another story to write in the dust. He started the engine and drove on, the road stretching out before him, no longer a trap, but a path. Block 7, years passed as they do in the desert, measured not in hours, but in the slow erosion of rock and the growth of mesquite. Elias became a fixture in the county, the wildlife guy that ranchers called instead of reaching for their rifles. His hair turned grey at the temples, matching the sagebrush, and his skin weathered to the color of sandstone. He saved hundreds of animals, owls, badgers, foxes, deer. Each one took a piece of his heart and gave something back in return. But he never forgot the amber eyes. Every year, on the anniversary of that Tuesday, he drove out to the gravel road. He would sit on the tailgate of his truck, drink a coffee, and watch the sunset. Sometimes he saw them, sometimes he just heard their song, the yipping, howling chorus that rose with the moon. The pack grew. The pup became the alpha. Elias could tell by the way he moved, by the confidence in his stride when he was visible on the ridge. He had survived. He had thrived. One winter, a harsh blizzard hit the high desert. It was the kind of storm that killed livestock and buried fences. The snow was 3 feet deep, drifting to 10. The roads were closed. The power was out. Elias was in his cabin, keeping the wood stove burning, worrying about the animals in the outdoor enclosures. He had moved them all inside the barn, but the cold was relentless. On the 3rd night of the storm, he heard a noise on his porch, a scratching. He grabbed his flashlight and opened the door. The wind howled, blowing snow into his face. There, curled up on the doormat, Huddled against the doorframe for warmth was an old coyote. Her coat was matted with ice. Her breathing was shallow. She was thin, her ribs showing through the wet fur. It was the mother. Elias knew her instantly. The shape of her ears, the white patch on her chest. She was ancient now in coyote years. Her time was ending. She looked up at him. Her eyes were cloudy, but the recognition was there. She hadn't come to hunt. She hadn't come to scavenge. She had come to the one place she knew was safe. She had come to the man who had saved her son. Elias didn't hesitate. He knelt down in the snow. "Come in, old girl," he whispered. "Come in out of the cold." He lifted her. She was light as a feather now, just bones and spirit. He carried her inside and laid her on the rug by the fire. He dried her fur with a towel. He offered her warm broth. She drank a little, then laid her head on his hand. She let out a long sigh, the tension leaving her body. She died an hour later, warm and safe, with Elias's hand stroking her head. Elias buried her the next morning when the storm broke. He buried her on the hill behind his cabin, facing the east, facing the sunrise. As he finished filling the grave, he heard it, a howl. It started low and mournful, then rose to a crescendo. Then another joined in, and another. He looked down into the valley. The pack was there. The alpha, the pup he had saved, stood in the front. He was looking up at the cabin. He was singing for his mother, and he was singing for the man who had given her a peaceful end. Elias stood in the snow, listening to the song. It wasn't a sad sound. It was a song of life, of connection, of the intricate, invisible web that binds all living things together. He realized then that he hadn't just saved a coyote that day on the road. He had entered into a covenant. He had become part of their story, and they had become the defining chapter of his. The song faded. The pack turned and vanished into the white landscape. Elias walked back to his cabin. He made a cup of coffee. He sat by the window and watched the sun come up over the mountains, illuminating the world in blinding white and gold. He was alone, but he wasn't lonely. He was part of the wild, and that was enough. The seasons in the high desert do not pass gently. They carve the landscape with wind, fire, and ice, reshaping the world one layer of sandstone at a time. For Elias, the years moved with the same rugged intensity. The man who had once measured his life in delivery quotas and missed deadlines now measured it in the migration of hawks, the blooming of the sagebrush, and the rehabilitation of the broken creatures that found their way to his door. His hair, once dark, had turned the color of ironwood, and the lines around his eyes had deepened, etched by the relentless sun and the smiles that came more easily now. He was no longer just an employee of the center. He was its heart, the old man of the canyon, a figure as constant and reliable as the sunrise. The sanctuary had grown under his care. New enclosures dotted the hillside, built with his own hands, designed to mimic the wild crevices and burrows of the animals' natural homes. He had saved bobcats caught in leg-hold traps, owls poisoned by rodenticide, and deer struck by cars on the interstate. But every evening, when the chores were done and the sun dipped below the mesa, painting the sky in bruising shades of violet and crimson, Elias's gaze would drift to the north, to the ridge, to the memory of amber eyes and a bond forged in blood and dust. He saw the pack often. They were the ghosts of the valley, slipping through the shadows of the juniper trees, their songs rising like smoke in the twilight. The pup he had saved, now a formidable alpha with a coat of silver and rust, led them. Elias called him Sul for the sun that had beaten down on them that day on the road. Sul never approached the sanctuary fences, never begged for food, never crossed the invisible line between the wild and the tame. But he watched. Often, Elias would look up from mending a fence or filling a water trough to see Sul standing on a high rock, his silhouette sharp against the sky, a silent sentinel acknowledging the man who had given him his life. It was a relationship defined by distance and respect, A perfect, unspoken understanding. Then came the winter of the Great Freeze. It was a weather event that the old-timers in town compared to the blizzards of the 1940s. The temperature plummeted to 20 degrees below zero. A cold so fierce it snapped tree limbs and froze water pipes solid. The snow didn't just fall, it drove horizontally, a white curtain of needles that buried the world in silence. For 3 days, the canyon was cut off. The roads were impassable. The power lines, heavy with ice, snapped like thread, plunging the sanctuary into darkness. Elias spent those days in a state of exhausted vigilance. He moved the most vulnerable animals, the tropical birds, the injured fawns, the recovering reptiles, into the main lodge, turning his living room into a makeshift Noah's Ark heated by a massive wood-burning stove. He hauled water from the frozen creek, breaking the ice with a sledgehammer, his breath pluming in the frigid air like dragon smoke. He slept in shifts, waking every 2 hours to stoke the fire and check the temperatures. It was a battle against the elements, a fight to keep the spark of life burning in the heart of a frozen tomb. On the 4th night, the wind died. The silence that followed was deafening, amplified by the insulating blanket of snow that lay 4 feet deep across the valley. The moon rose, full and blindingly bright, turning the landscape into a glittering, otherworldly kingdom of blue and silver. Elias stepped out onto the porch of the lodge to get a breath of fresh air, the cold biting his lungs. He scanned the perimeter, his eyes adjusting to the moonlight. That was when he saw her. At the edge of the clearing, where the forest gave way to the sanctuary grounds, a dark shape was struggling through the deep drifts. It wasn't a deer. The movement was too labored, too low. It wasn't a mountain lion. The silhouette was wrong. Elias squinted, stepping off the porch into the snow, the crust breaking under his boots. The figure collapsed, then struggled up again, driven by a desperation that overrode the shutting down of its body. Elias grabbed his heavy coat and a flashlight, though the moon rendered the light unnecessary. He waded through the snow, his heart hammering a warning rhythm. As he got closer, the shape became clear. It was a coyote, but not Sewell. This coyote was smaller, frail, its coat matted with ice and grey with age. It was moving toward the lodge not with the stealth of a predator, but with the singular focus of a creature seeking the only safe harbor it knew. Elias stopped 10 feet away. The coyote lifted its head. One ear was tattered, a notch missing from the tip, a battle scar from a youth spent fighting for survival. The muzzle was white with age. But the eyes were the same. Amber, intelligent, and filled with a recognition that spanned years and species. It was the mother. She was ancient now, far past the typical lifespan of a wild coyote. Her time was ending. The storm had been the final blow, sapping the last of her reserves, freezing the marrow in her old bones. She could have laid down in the sagebrush to die alone, covered by the snow. She could have retreated to a den to pass in the dark. But she hadn't. She had walked miles through the blizzard, fighting the drifts, fighting the cold, to come here, to him. "Hey, old girl," Elias whispered, his voice cracking in the frozen air. "You made it a long way." She didn't growl. She didn't flinch. She simply looked at him, her body trembling violently, her legs giving way. She sank into the snow, letting out a long, shuddering breath that misted in the moonlight. She was surrendering, not to death, but to him. Elias fell to his knees, ignoring the cold seeping into his jeans. He pulled off his gloves so he could feel her. He placed his warm hands on her freezing flank, feeling the faint, fluttery beat of her heart. She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes. It was the ultimate act of trust. The predator, who had once threatened to tear his throat out to protect her pup, was now placing her own dying body in his hands. "I've got you," Elias said, the tears freezing on his cheeks. "I've got you. You're not going to freeze out here." He scooped her up. She was impossibly light, a bundle of hollow bones and coarse fur. He held her close to his chest, sharing his body heat, and carried her back to the lodge. He kicked the door open and brought her into the warmth of the firelight. The other animals, the raccoon in the crate, the owl on the perch, went silent, sensing the presence of the wild matriarch. Elias laid her on the thick rug in front of the wood stove. He got warm towels and gently dried her fur, melting the ice balls that clung to her paws. He offered her a bowl of warm broth, holding it to her muzzle. She lapped at it weakly, her rough tongue grazing his fingers, then laid her head back down on his knee. They sat like that for hours. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Elias stroked her head, tracing the line of her jaw, the velvet softness of her ears. He talked to her, telling her about the years, about Sul, about the day on the road. He told her she had done a good job, that she had been a good mother, that her legacy was safe. "You raised a king," Elias whispered. "You know that. He runs this valley because of you." She let out a soft sound, a sigh that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. Her breathing slowed. The trembling stopped. She was warm now. She was safe. She was not alone. Just before dawn, as the fire burned down to glowing embers, she opened her eyes one last time. She looked at Elias, her gaze clear and lucid. There was no fear, only peace. She pressed her nose against his palm, a final gesture of connection, and then she closed her eyes. Her chest rose and fell one last time, and then stopped. Elias sat in the silence, his hand resting on her still form. He didn't move for a long time. He felt a profound sense of loss, but also a deep, resonant gratitude. She had chosen him for her end. She had completed the circle that began with a terrified pup in a fence. She had given him the gift of her final trust. When the sun rose, blinding and brilliant, over the snow-covered canyon, Elias wrapped her body in the wool blanket, the same type of blanket he had used to save her son all those years ago. He carried her outside. The air was still and cold, the sky a piercing blue. He dug a grave on the hill behind the lodge, beneath an ancient juniper tree that overlooked the valley. The ground was frozen, and it took him hours to break through the earth. But he didn't stop. He sweated and cried and dug until it was done. He laid her to rest, covering her with the soil of the home she had ruled. As he placed the final stone on the cairn, a sound cut through the morning air. It started as a single high-pitched note, pure and mournful. Then another joined it, and another. A chorus of howls rising from the valley floor, echoing off the canyon walls, filling the world with a song of grief and honor. Elias turned. Down in the meadow, standing in the deep snow, was the pack. There were a dozen of them now, and in the front, standing tall and proud, was Sul. The Alpha was looking up at the hill. He was looking at the grave, and he was looking at Elias. Sul threw his head back and let out a howl that shook the snow from the trees. It was a song for his mother. It was a song for the end of an era, and it was a song for the man who stood between the worlds. Elias stood by the grave, his hand on the rough bark of the juniper tree, and listened. He didn't try to hide his tears. He let the song wash over him, feeling the vibration of it in his bones. He was part of this pack, in a way that no other human could understand. He belonged to them, and they to him. The howling lasted for minutes, a requiem that seemed to suspend time. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence rushed back in, heavier than before. Sol lowered his head. He looked at Elias one last time, a look of shared sorrow and eternal bond. Then he turned and trotted into the tree line, his pack following in his wake, disappearing like smoke into the forest. Elias stayed on the hill until the sun was high overhead. He looked out at the vast white desert, at the fence lines and the roads, at the scars of civilization and the resilience of the wild. He thought about the delivery driver he used to be, the man who was always rushing, always late, always trapped by time. That man was gone, buried under the years of dust and wind. In his place was a man who knew the value of stopping, a man who knew that the most important deliveries weren't packages, but acts of mercy. A man who had looked into the eyes of a terrified creature and found his own reflection. He walked back down the hill to the lodge. There were animals to feed. There was wood to chop. There was life to sustain. Elias opened the door and stepped into the warmth. He paused, looking back at the ridge one last time. "Goodbye, Mama," he whispered. "Rest easy." He closed the door, ready for the work of the day, carrying the amber eyes in his heart, forever. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever witnessed or lived something like